May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
She had driven by the church many, many times over the years and never paid any attention to it until one day, suddenly, it caught her attention. A small, modest church sitting off to her right on the road as she made her way to work. She really had never taken much interest in the church since she had left it as a teenager, having been thrown essentially out of the church she'd grown up in because her lifestyle was perceived as unacceptable. The relationship between she and a girlfriend were considered demonic, and she was labeled as the brood of Satan and consigned to hell. She left with great pain and sorrow. Sadly, her parents were not much more supportive, and so when she left for college, she found little reason to go back home. However, she did notice this church. And as she approached 30, found a gnawing, deep-seated urge and longing for something that she couldn't quite identify. So one day she pulled into the parking lot and read the sign. Lo and behold, it was an Episcopal church. She sat there, got out, walked into the garden, and sat on a bench where she found a kind of peacefulness that she hadn't known for a while. Thought it was interesting, but still, her level of resentment, suspicion, anger at betrayal overrode any desire to come back. Some months went by, and she did make the journey back. She came on Sunday mornings and sat in her vehicle in the parking lot, watching people go to church. She did that for a number of Sundays. One Sunday, she even got up the nerve to get out. She walked out and went towards the doors, but then some other people started to arrive, and she felt terrified, and she went back to her car and left. Again, weeks went by, and she got out of the car that one Sunday morning and went to the door, opened the door, and walked slowly into the entryway, where she again became fearful and turned to leave when she heard over her shoulder a voice say, "Hello, good morning, how are you?" And she turned around to see an elderly gentleman with a warm and gentle smile. And he said, "Hey, I'm Bill. Welcome home." And before she could kind of do anything, though she really wanted to leave, he came and took her hand and said, "Let me show you around." And he took her down to the parish hall and showed her the classrooms and talked about this church. And by the time they got back to the entryway where she again was preparing to leave, she said, "You know, the service is about ready to start. Why don't you come in and sit with me back here in the back?" So she reluctantly followed him in. Although she was perspiring with nervous anxiety, there she sat. And fortunately, he was with her. He could help her through the service because she certainly wasn't familiar with that Episcopal service. And as it turns out, when he went to communion, she took the opportunity to slip out of the pew and leave. Weeks went by, and he thought, well, she may never come again. He had hoped she would. But some weeks later, she appeared again. And there was Bill sitting in the back pew, looked around with a big smile on his face, and she smiled back and slid into the pew next to him. And she found a little place where she could feel some safety and comfort. She sat there a number of Sundays, 6, 7, 8 maybe, before she finally followed him up to communion. Coming back, he noticed she didn't stop at the pew but went straight out the door, and he thought, oh dear, she's gone again. But in a few minutes, she came back and sat in the pew, and he realized as he looked at her face that she'd been in the bathroom crying. After the service was over, he grabbed her hand before she could leave and said, let's go in the parish hall. Let's have some coffee. And she followed him in there, and they actually began to have a conversation. She asked him, Bill, why did you, on my first Sunday here, say, welcome home? This isn't home, it's a church. And Bill began to share his own personal story. He said, you know, many years ago, I left church too. I had become disillusioned. I had become totally put off by all of the seeming trappings of religiosity. The institutional church, as I found out in college, was full of abuses, abusing people, abusing power, abusing wealth for its own particular purposes and glory. Nothing to do with God. It all had to do with the frailty of human beings. People in the church were dishonest. They were full of hypocrites. Clergy who didn't care about anybody but themselves and didn't care about the real needs of the world. She kind of looked at him surprised. Some of her own feelings being expressed there. He said, but you know, I moved here a few years ago to this little town to be near some family. I'm a widower. And I started noticing this church. I grew up in the Episcopal Church, so I kind of came here a few Sundays, and I sat in the back, didn't participate, just watched. Finally got up the gall to go to communion. And at the door, as I walked out that particular Sunday, the young priest stuck out his hand and said, hello, I'm Doug. Welcome home. Welcome home. And I've been here, he said, almost every Sunday since. And I've kind of made this my home. Well, it's quite a journey, that. Just at that point, as they finished this little conversation, up came the priest, and he stuck out his hand to her and said, good morning, I'm Doug, welcome home. And she looked at him and she said, well, Bill's been very nice to me, but I have to ask something of you. If you really knew me, would you still welcome me here? Because I have been thrown out before. And they both looked at her and said, sure, ask away. And she said, I have a partner back at my home, a female, a woman I love very much, I hope someday to marry. Are we still welcome here? And they both smiled and said, absolutely. Absolutely. And Bill spoke up and said, bring her next Sunday. We'll have a place. Sit with me in the back. I'd be happy to have you with me. And she started to cry and hug them both. She had come home. Dear people of God, we don't always get the chance for those who find their way by the power of the Spirit back. Many continue to be alienated, hurt, injured by the church's indifference or its brutality. And those of us who stand up front, those of us who know how often Holy Mother Church can be a brutal mother. In the course of that conversation, she asked Bill, before the rector came up, had his opinion of the church changed? And he said, no, not really. But I did learn over all those years and wandering around and looking for answers that the church is made up of human beings just like me, just as broken, just as flawed, no better, no worse, some kind, some compassionate, some not, some mean-spirited and evil, some not, some kind and caring beyond imagining, generous beyond belief, and some not. But I don't come to church for them. And the church does not give me what I need. I come to church to be fed on the bread of life. Because no matter how flawed the church, no matter how unfaithful it has been in its journey and loyalty to God, Jesus has not been unfaithful. And the Jesus who called this organization, this organism, the body of Christ, into being, has been faithful and continues to be faithful. You know, this series of 5 weeks that we're looking at the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John started with the feeding of the multitude, 5,000. You know, somebody asked me once, do you really think there were 5,000? I said, I don't know. It says 5,000 here, another gospel. All the Gospels tell us there are multitudes. One tells us 5 and 4,000, that is. But when I pointed out that person, I said, you know, I don't know whether that was the exact number. But what I can tell you is that over the course of the world's history, untold hundreds of millions have been fed. That's really a pauper and meager amount, 5,000. Think of it, any given day of the week, tens of thousands of people are fed on the bread of life all across this globe. Go on from there and think about Sundays. Tens of millions every Sunday from Australia when the sun starts to rise as it comes west across to us. Tens of millions. And if we go to Easter, and the Orthodox churches happen to synchronize with our calendar on Easter celebration, hundreds of millions are fed across the globe on every continent. So that first account, really kind of a puny number. What Jesus has been able to do in feeding the hungry throughout the generations is beyond our believing. And yet it goes on, and Bill and Ann, that woman who came back to the church, have been fed, and so have we, more or less. We come here, it's a beautiful place. And churches are great, and we need places where we count things as holy and special and sacred for us. But our world is surrounded by so many things and challenges and difficulties. Our own personal lives are filled with enough disappointments, hurts, pains, illness, brokenness, sadness, and joy. We look at a world, Afghanistan, earthquakes in Haiti, among the most desperately poor, fires in California, floods in our own community, global warming, COVID throughout the globe. Any number of circumstances weigh on us. Where do we find God in the midst of this life? You can search everywhere. Some of us have tried. No place will you find that you will be truly fed if you realize that it is not the institution but the presence of the Lord Himself that brings the bread of life. Wonderful writer and theologian Henry Nouwen in his book Reaching Out says, only when we have gotten in touch with our own life experience and have learned to listen to the inner cravings of our soul to realize that Jesus did not just speak, but that He reached out to us in the most personal of needs. The gospel doesn't just contain ideas worth remembering. It is a message responding to the individual human condition. The church, with all of its flaws, and it is flawed, is a community of people inviting us still to come and still our hungers and thirsts at the tables where Jesus gives His presence and nurture to us. where he continues to feed us with the true bread that feeds our souls, our very hearts, our being. That the doctrines that we hold dear are not just arcane formulations that we must adhere to or reject, but they are rather the documentation of profound human experiences passed on from generation to generation, holding light in the darkness. We know that the vastness of God cannot even be contained in the universe, but small enough to dwell in our hearts. That's why we come again and again, because God so cared for this world, so cares for us, so desires us, as we hear those beautiful words of invitation that we use at the Celtic service. Come, all of you, no matter what, come. You are welcome. This is the table not of the church, but of Jesus. And it is his will that we meet him here to be fed by him. So those of us who've kind of found a connection here, have found a home in the midst of this place, in this community of faith, may we reach out to the broken, the hungry, the hurting. God knows the thousands who have walked away, those who have never come through the door. Help them come and find a home, a place where they are loved by the grace of God, fed by the Lamb himself on the true bread of life. Oh, and by the way, just in case no one's ever said it to you before, welcome home.